tell botanists, because anytime they're looking at a plant, they'll do this. In fact, I have photographs of botanists out in the field, and one of the first things they'll do is smash up a leaf just to get an odor. Because many plants you can distinguish, you'll know the family, or you're going to get close because of the smell. I'll say more about this one because we're going to cover that family. The other plant that we're going to have two plants today. This one actually has some fruits on it, and this may not look like an avocado, and it's not, but it's a close relative of the avocado. It's in the same genus. This is Persea borbonia. This is our common, or once common. It's no longer common. It's a sad tale, and that's why I'm giving it to you, called red bay. This was one of the more common shrubs in the southeastern U.S., and it's basically functionally extinct in nature. And I'll say more about that. This also has a characteristic smell, by the way, as do many members of this family. Again, anytime I pass out a leaf material, smash it up. So that's, sorry, here's one for you guys. That's the red bay. There's a little fruit on there. Well, kind of a mini one, I guess. But this is a sad tale where a beetle was brought in accidentally from Asia into Savannah. We even know where this happened. The beetle carries a fungus that lives symbiotic with it. It just carries this fungus around. The fungus is the infection that kills the plant. It basically blocks the conducting system, and basically it kind of just starves. Nothing's moving through the xylem anymore. But anyway, this plant, there is a living plant across right in front of New and Ziegler. You can see it, beautiful. The reason it's alive is because they spray it to keep it alive. But this is an ongoing, repeated story. I like to tell these things, not so you just learn plants, so that you learn what's going on. Over the past 100 years, many trees have met this same demise. Something has been introduced, it kills them, and now they are basically going extinct in the wild. It would be a very beautiful tree. Okay, so I'll say more about red bay. Your TAs will tell you about your plant collections. I know many of you are eager to begin, so you can do that, but they're going to give you all the gory details. I'm not going to say much more than this. This is what we've already mentioned, the points, when they're going to be due. They're going to go over what they expect you to turn in, okay? So that you do not take a bunch of things out of your refrigerator the day before they're due, smack them between two pieces of paper and bring them in. That will not work, okay? But it's a good way to get some points. All right, these are angiosperm features that I reviewed last time. I'm not going to review them again. I'm just going to say that if you put flower, when I asked this question, notice when I said when I asked this question on the next exam, a flower is not a good answer. These are the really good answers in red. I'll probably give you ovule with 2 integuments, although some of them actually have been reduced down to 1. But these are really the key features of a flowering plant. Okay, so do not miss that. It will be on the exam. Here's what we're dealing with right now in flowering plant world. This is our basal angiosperm view of the 400,000 or so species of flowering plants that are out there. We have Amberella, water lilies, and this group Austrobaileales, and Elysium is being passed around that represents that group right there. So what I want to do is review some terms, because we're going to use these terms over and over and over again throughout the semester. And chances are also very good that you will be asked to define these terms, probably in lab, but certainly in the next lecture, okay? So how's that for another hint as for test questions? So perianth. This is a collective term for the sepals and petals together. So you might ask somebody, would you describe the perianth of that flower? And they would say, well, there really aren't any sepals, they're just petals. Or, well, the sepals are green, the petals are kind of purplish. It's a collective term. You want to know about the sepals and petals together. It's a collective term. Okay, got that? You'll see it, every description in your book will talk about the perianth. So you just need to know that term. This may sound like a complicated word, but merosity means actually what it says. Meros refers to number. And it's a term that asks, describing the number of floral parts. Are the parts, we'll ask, are the parts in 4s? Are the parts in 3s? Are the parts in 5s? Or just sort of all over the place, what we call indeterminate? We don't know. There are all kinds of things. But you'll see that in many plant groups, the parts are in 3s, like the monocots and some of these basal lineage. So in the eudicots, parts will be in 4s and 5s, and that's merosity. So when somebody in your lab asks you, or one of your friends, you know, what's the merosity of that flowering plant family? And say, parts are always in 3s. Got it? Merosity. Now, this is a term we're only going to use briefly, and it's a very specific type of stamen. You've already seen it. I mentioned this term last time, what we call a laminar stamen. It's a stamen that basically looks clearly like a leaf. Laminar means flat, a plate. So it looks like these stamens actually look like a plate, like a leaf. And I showed you some diagrams of those. Okay, and some of these families we're going to cover now, like Amborella, they really have these laminar type stamens, these leaf-like stamens. They don't look like the stamens you learned about in your intro bio class whenever you end up taking one. Okay, they're what we think are probably the ancestral stamen. All these floral parts are leaves, remember. Now we'll also like this term tepals. Tepals. Now the classic flower that you learn has sepals and petals, right? Sepals are typically what color? It's not green, right? We think of them as this outer protective group of parts, and then inside of that are petals that are colorful. But in a number of plant families, especially where we are now at the base of the flowering plants, there's no differentiation between sepals and petals. So what are you going to call them? I think, what's the best term if you can't tell them apart? Tepals. Tepals. When there's no clear distinction, just call them, it's just a great term, tepals. Okay, Amborella, for example, has tepals. And this is something, it looks like another big word, phyllotaxy, but it's really talking about how parts are arranged in the flower. Very important. You're going to want to be able to tell people are parts spirally arranged. We're going to see a number of flowers now that are spirally arranged, but eventually flowers are going to get pretty boring and all become very rural in their arrangement of floral parts. But right now we'll see a bit of both in these basal lineages. And that arrangement is called phyllotaxy. Okay? Everybody got those terms? So I'm going to start throwing them around, and we're using them a lot in complete sentences, and hopefully that will reinforce that. So what I'm going to do now, do this again, is we're going to go through Amborella, and we're going to use some of these terms. We're going to describe the family. And we're going to do this over for one family after the next for the rest of the semester. Now, when you read your book and when you look at the descriptions that I put up on the screen, you're going to see lots of stuff, okay? And you're going to say, oh, one good way to study, by the way, some people like to put all of these in a little like flashcards or whatever way you want to do it. But what I will always do is highlight for you, because you're here, some features that you want to key in on. Because a lot of the features that describe some of these plants are common. They're like, everything has them. They have leaves. Oh, wow, that helps a lot. But maybe there's something special about the leaves. Maybe there's something special about the flowers. That's what I'm going to highlight with color. And when you study, that's what you want to jump to in your notes, okay? Now, it is not so hard to become an expert on Amborella, because this family, Amborellaceae, has how many genera? One. And how many species? One. Okay. So it's a shrub or a small tree. Notice that's not highlighted because lots of plants are trees. But it's a very unusual, cool flowering plant. It has no vessel elements. And remember, in the past, that was always thought to be a very key characteristic. The first flowering plants must have had vessels. But where is Amborella placed? In a tree, in a phylogeny. It's it's the sister to all other flowering plants. That was an amazing discovery. It has no vessels. We now think that the first flowering plants probably didn't have vessels. We came a little later, which is kind of a cool way, shows why phylogeny is so important. Okay, the leaves are simple and alternate. You'll see one in lab, by the way, but that happens a lot too. Now, the other thing about Amborella is it has these separate female flowers. You don't know which one is which. You should have a little arrow here. Female flower and male flower, here enlarged thousands of times because they would actually fit on your fingernail. Yes, question?
Last class we defined vessel as the ovary. Is that how we're
Vessel is a conducting element in the xylem. That's what conducts the water. I don't know what, did I say something?
Angio, I guess angio refers to vessel.
Oh, angios refers, it's Greek for, it means like a ship, that kind of vessel, like a container. And so it's the container that contains the seeds, the ovules. So that's what angios is Greek for, we'll just call it container. Yeah.
Well,
So now we're talking about conductive cells. So that's these vessel elements that are like the straws that move the water up and down the plant. And Amborella does not have those. Okay, so here's this male. This is unusual to have. It has these separate male and female flowers. Now these are stamens, and I showed this last time how leaf-like these are. These are really, these are laminar stamens. Okay. Here is the female flower, and it has carpels. But also notice, let's talk about the perianth. Describe the perianth for me. Do you see clear sepals and petals? No. I don't see anything like greenish. In fact, this is a great example of tepals. Okay, tepals. The other thing, let's talk about the phyllotaxy. Maybe hard for you to see, but are the parts spiral or are they whorled? Whorled means all in one plane, right? They all are attached to one place. Spiral means what it sounds like. These are actually spiral. They just sort of spiral around along in their attachment. And that is all, a lot of that is summarized here. Here are the flowers. I've used blue to highlight key things here. The carpels are separate. Their number varies. Now this is really unusual. The carpels are not really sealed in the process of development. They're sealed in a way that we see in a number of these early flowering plant lineages or basal lineages. They're kind of glued shut. It's like you really want to make something close and you just use super glue. You know, I haven't got this figured out yet, but I'm working on it. And it's sort of that sort of sense of how this is evolving. Yes? Is it dioecious or monoecious? This is a monoecious plant. You can have male and female flowers sometimes on the same plant. It's kind of a they're considered. Okay, I'm confusing you. Sorry. They're technically dioecious. You'll have one plant that has female flowers, another plant that has male flowers. Just remember it that way. But we've grown these plants in the greenhouse because we've studied them a lot, and they're very interesting because they change. This is not supposed to happen, but some plants do this. They change their mind. So a plant that has been male for many, many years all of a sudden switches and becomes female, or a plant that is female may produce a few male flowers. But in the textbook definition says they're dioecious. Does everybody know what that means? Two houses. Two houses. Literally, if you translate it from the Greek, two households, two separate plants. One male, one female. So just remember it that way. This is what happens when you study things. You learn things can be more complex than you thought. There's lots of things have superior ovaries and one ovule for carpel, and the fruit are these little drupes. You're going to have a fruit lab, so don't worry about that. But I'm highlighting some of the things in blue. There are lots of stamens, lots of stamens in that flower. I don't know how many are up there, 15, 20, lots of them. And I said those laminar stamens. So remember the things in blue, okay? The other things are kind of common features when you study these things. I'm just going to throw this out because when you read your textbook, they're often going to say, well, where are the ovules attached? That's called placentation, okay? In Amborella, it's marginal. The ovules are attached on the margin of the carpel, and sometimes in other plants they're attached in different places. These are features that people use to describe plants. I don't care if you remember the placentation of Amborella. I'm just showing you that when you read your textbook, this is a term you're going to see. All right? And in some cases, we will highlight it because it's a really big deal. And it's easy to distinguish a family because of it. At this point, I don't care if you remember that Amborella has marginal placentation. Everybody okay with that? So what do you want to remember about Amborella?
Carpels. 5 or 6 separate.
Parts are separate. Yeah, this is an interesting trend. In these basal lineages, you're going to see a lot of parts that are separate, not fused. Fusion of parts comes later on in flowering plant evolution. So we'll have separate parts. We'll often have lots of parts, not a clear number. Amborella shows these things because it has lots of stamens. It's spirally arranged parts. It has tepals. Some of these basal angiosperms will often have tepals. Okay. What about the water conducting? Does it have vessel elements? No. Okay, that's kind of amazing. Yes? Oh, is there anything else? Okay. All right. So, and it has these leaf-like stamens. That's unusual. That's cool, too. So, the genome of Amborella was sequenced a few years ago. At that time, because it was old technology, it cost a few $1 million. And you might ask, or your friend might ask, or somebody says, why would you sequence the complete genome of Amborella? Is it a crop? No. Why does it matter? So this is sort of an educational element. I think I'll put this on the next test. Why would you sequence something that's not a crop? Because some people think, why would you ever bother with anything that's not economically important? And you, as informed biologists or citizens, would want an answer to that. Yes?
So you can better determine the evolutionary relationships of plants overall, and then you can determine genes for gene resistance?
Yeah, so you're really close. So think of where Amborella is. It is sister to all other flowering plants, right? That is an amazing position. It is our closest living connection to the first angiosperms, which are now extinct, right? So how, if you're going to study a crop like corn or wheat or rice or tomatoes, and you're going to look at these genes, as you mentioned, or the genome, how do you interpret what you see without some sort of simpler reference? And that's where these things like Amborella are so important. The way I like it's a reference. It's a simpler way to interpret what has happened in these more derived flowering plants, okay? So Amborella would be your biplane of evolution. If you want to understand flight, start with a biplane. Don't start with this sophisticated jet fighter. Your crop is this, Amborella is this. It helps you interpret why this thing works. Does everybody get that? I see some, yeah? It's a reference. Okay, question.
So for genome sequencing, it kind of acts as the outgroup.
Great. I like that. It's an outgroup, even though it's a flowering plant. It is still an outgroup because it sits at the sister to all these other flowering plants. So it's a great way to interpret what has happened in these more evolutionarily derived lineages. So if you put on the next test, it's sort of like an outgroup to compare to all these other flowering plants. I will accept that. But this is why this is done. It's also done in the mammal world. This is why the duckbill platypus genome was sequenced. Is it of economically important? I don't know, maybe some people eat duckbill platypus, which is not a good idea, they're rare. But it was sequenced for the same reason, to help interpret your genome, the features in your genome. How do we make sense of those without some sort of outgroup, without a reference? Everybody, do you get this? Okay, so when you see this kind of stuff in the papers, and somebody says, oh, they spent all this money to sequence some genome, and you say, it's not, you'll say, well, of course we sequence things that are not crops. This is our best way to understand what happened in those crop genomes, how they evolved to begin with. And then in fact, here is this genome, this plant of Amborella on the recent cover of Genetics, because they used it for exactly that reason. They wanted to look at the evolution of a gene process in flowering plants. How do you interpret it in corn and rice and wheat? They use Amborella. It was their outgroup for comparison, and it was so cool it made the cover. All right, so let's move on to the water lilies. We have a lot of things to cover. So the water lilies are a family where you can mistreat, you can practice child abuse. Okay, this is a normal size child on a water lily, a member of this family, which I'll come to, and people do, wow, how did you get away with that? Okay. But we'll talk more about that cool flowering plant in just a little bit. Remember, this is the next branch up of flowering plants, the water lilies or Nymphaceae. This is a pretty big, well, it's not that big. Okay, again, I use blue or red. Sometimes I just switch colors around to keep you interested. Oftentimes I'll use blue to highlight key features. The water lilies, or the Nymphaceae, are aquatic. There are no woody water lilies, by the way. They are all herbaceous. They have these cool, striking, floating flowers. Okay. Here's the size. I usually give that 8 genera, 70 species. They're not huge. They have a long fossil record. They go back to the early Cretaceous. So some of the oldest fossils we have are actually of this family. Okay, the biggest genus is Nymphea, which we have here natively, and you'll often see in botanic gardens. But that cool thing up there is Kabamba, which is often in an aquaria. Okay, so here we go. Let's look at some of the floral features of the water lilies. The flowers are bisexual. Does everybody know what that means? We have flowers that have stamens and carpels in one flower, both sexes in one flower. They're actinomorphic. Does everybody know what that means? Any way you cut them, it's like radial symmetry, like a starfish. Okay? Whereas we are not radial symmetric. There's only one way I can cut you and get two parts that are mirror images, and that's up and down. And we'll see some flowers that have that kind of symmetry, but a lot of these flowers will have actinomorphic symmetry, radial symmetry. Okay, so here's again a case where we have tepals. Tepals. We'll see a lot of tepals because we don't have a clear distinction in many of these between sepals and petals. Good thing to remember. Now, we saw this in Amborella where we have these sterile stamens called staminodes. That's a sterile, they're just stamens that are sterile. They don't produce any good pollen. We have 3 to many stamens, and the stamens can be kind of cool. Sometimes they look very petaloid, and other times they look typical. I'll show you that. There can be lots of carpels. The ovary can vary in position. The fruit can vary. That's why I don't highlight any of those. So chances are, if we're going to show you an aquatic plant that's with solitary flowers that float, in tepals, it may be a water lily. There are a few curveballs out there. Yes?
If the stamens are stamens, how does it realize?
Oh, some of them aren't. It has so it does. Not all the stamens are sterile. It has both good stamens as well as stamens. I probably should. So this is what I mean by 3 to many stamens. Some of them are functional. Some of them are staminodes. Yeah, good point. So here shows some of the variation in the water. This plant Kabamba, okay, it just looks like it has 3 and 3. You know, the parts are kind of whorled. It looks very simple. But then you'll see some of these nymphaeas, these water lilies that we love to cultivate, and they'll have lots and lots of parts. And here you can actually see on some of them, like this one out here, the outer ones look to have a little bit of green on them. They're maybe a tiny bit sepal-like. But still, they're also similar. We call them tepals. And in fact, if you take apart a water lily, an nymphea, from the outermost part to the innermost part, you can see this gradation of things that have a little bit of green, and then they get white, and then these are probably sterile stamens. They have a little bit of no real pollen production, and then somewhere you start getting real pollen production here. And then this is all the parts in one flower. So it just shows how they transition. It's kind of cool, actually. And then eventually you get to the center where you have the carpels that are shown.